That really simple definition of impact investing, all you're doing is adding more information to your decision-making process. You want every scrap of information you can possibly get access to, because those are the things that are going to make a difference to your ability to sustain performance in the long run. We aren't yet at a point where there is a mandate or requirement that the actual social or environmental performance is really the central decision-making pillar. And that is the end point that we'd like to see an impact investing market that actually competes on impact. Climate's a little bit easier to understand. There's a broad agreement that a version of metric tons of carbon dioxide is the lingua franca of climate investing. In lots of other areas, we can't even quite agree on what good looks like yet. Is this a place where I could still actually make pretty compelling risk-adjusted returns? Is this a place where I can still make great returns, but I'm going to have to accept some type of disproportionate risk? Is this a place where I'm going to be lucky to just get my cash back? Am I going to be happy if I just get 70 cents on the dollar? Because 70 cents on the dollar is 70 cents more than 0 cents on the dollar of just giving it away.
Over 83% of you that listen to or watch this show regularly haven't yet subscribed to this show. So could I ask you for a favor before we start today? If you like the show and if you like what we do here and you want to support us, the free and simple way that you can do just that is by hitting the subscribe button or following us on your podcast app. It helps this channel more than you know. Thank you and enjoy this episode. Michael, it's great to meet you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be with you.
Before we dive into the business side, I want to start with something I find really important, and that's the early chapters of your story. And when I look at someone who's achieved what you've achieved, I'm always curious about the environment that shaped you. So tell me about growing up in Massachusetts. What was your household like? What were your parents doing? What kind of conversations were happening around the dinner table at night? And maybe there's experiences or conversations that might have planted the seeds for what you do today.
Where I come from, it actually does make a bit of sense. On one side, my mother was a writer, editor, and local elected official. And then on the other side, my dad was a manager in a pharmaceutical business and then went to work in the public sector at the end of his career. So that intersection between different sectors and different worlds started pretty early on, right? Remember those mushy marches here in New England, going out and jamming lawn signs in around town with my mother. And then on the other side of the fence, my dad's side and dad work is what led me to want to read the business section of the paper when I was just getting into college years later. Those two strands really kind of came together from pretty early on for me.
And what part of Massachusetts did you grow up in?
I grew up down on the South Shore in Norwell.
And your entire childhood you were there?
Pretty much. Born in New Jersey, but not there long enough to really remember that phase of time. Otherwise, straight through there, and then have not strayed far since, actually. University here, live here still. Wife and kids are here still. I've worked here for 20 plus years. It's been home.
You went to Harvard as an undergraduate in 2002, and you studied social studies, and I guess you decided to do this at the ripe age of 18 years old. So why social studies, and what were you thinking your life was going to look like at that point? What attracted you to Harvard specifically? I guess you could bring your laundry home on weekends.
The idea at that time was actually probably much closer to the experience. My mom's work, the focus on politics and policy was really where I thought I was going in life. I'd spent a lot of time doing that type of work in high school. I had a lot of internships and explored those types of opportunities, again, as a way of really giving back. What was the thing that I could do? Where could I make a difference? What would that be? And that took me to Harvard in part because of the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School, which was and still is a really vibrant undergrad institution where you get to learn from and see a little bit of the sausage making of policy and politics from folks that are there making those decisions. So that's what brought me there. And that is where I spent a really significant portion of my time as an undergrad, was in those halls, listening to those folks.
Were there any particular moments during that period that fundamentally changed how you see systems and social change?
For better or worse, was spending a lot of time on the unsuccessful 2004 John Kerry for President campaign. And the experience of doing that work and spending time also working at the convention there both gave me a glimpse into the unique thing that campaigns are, which is one of very few things in the world that is built and then completely dismantled. Right? Otherwise, organizations have this tendency to build and build and build and survive and continue to protect themselves. But in this world, they're not built to last. They're built to end. And the ending was, of course, not the one that I wanted. Going through that experience, I think, was just a good reminder that best intentions, all the effort you can put forward, it's not always going to work. There are other perspectives, there are other forces at work, and just realizing that is part of the system that you're operating in. It was a hard learning, but it was an important learning, and complemented more of the book learning side of things. Social studies is sort of like a PPE program, to put it in terms that the rest of the world understands. And so it's a lot of different ways of looking at how people make decisions. Right? You can look at it through an economic lens. You can look at it through a psychological lens. You can look at it through a sociological lens. And really, that is what I was spending my time doing on the book learning side of things, complemented by a little bit more of that real life learning of, oh, this is hard. And I think that's something that is carried forward to this day.
But a political campaign's a bit like making a feature film where all these people come together for a specific period of time, and then either the movie's really good or nobody sees the movie.
You got to put it out there and see how the world reacts.
You graduated from Harvard with this bachelor's, and you straight away joined the Bridgespan group. That's quite specific choice. It's a nonprofit advisory firm. What initially drew you to Bridgespan and working in the social sector? And what attracted you to this intersection of strategy consulting and social impact?
The pragmatic version was, when you look at trying to find a job in your final year of college, the place where I thought I might end up, which would be in policy and politics in DC. What that meant, I had no idea at the ripe age of 17 or whatever it was, looking ahead to graduation year. But those jobs, generally, you don't get them more than 2 months in advance if you're lucky, sometimes 2 weeks, right? You have to show up and jump straight into a process. But strategy consulting and other businesses actually plan in advance. So I had the opportunity to jump into that pool and kind of test out, alongside the more traditional McKinsey, Bain, BCG, the Bridgespan opportunity. And it turns out Bridgespan's the only one that offered me a job. The thing that I think I learned about myself in that was I'd also applied to fellowships and all the usuals, got nothing out of that, is that if I don't actually want to do something, I don't tend to do a particularly good job of it. And Bridgespan was the thing where I sat down, I wrote a different cover letter from scratch, right? I actually had something to say. I had a perspective. I was interested in the work. I was interested in the ideas of what at that time was still a relatively young organization, probably just about 4.5, 5 years old when I would have been applying. And the idea that there was a translation of these really rigorous tools, training, practices into a world that had pro-social benefit or pro-social outcome. That's interesting. Like, what happens when you put these back to the dinner table, these different sectors together, these intersections? Obviously, happily, 20 years later, here I still am. But that was really what the spark came from, was the idea of doing something that is aligned with where I'd spent a lot of my time kind of personally and philosophically, but from a totally different vantage point than I'd ever focused on before.
So when you showed up with a new shirt and tie and all that, what were you doing originally for them?
Pretty much the standard place you begin in consulting as an analyst, which is both really learning, honestly, for the first year, you just learn a lot, both through the formal training and the informal training, but learning how to use data to inform decisions. I didn't know the second half of that really at the beginning. It was just the data part, right? Coming in and understanding both quantitative and qualitative data that could inform, not to a level of academic certainty, which is more where I'd been before, but to a level of decision-making certainty. What's the best choice? What's the best path forward here? Usually not having enough data or not having the data that you wanted and trying to get as close as you can, particularly in the social sector work, a lot more qualitative and a lot more almost creating the data than you can sometimes find in more traditional commercial environments.
And then I think somewhere in these earlier years, you supported the first U.S. policy agenda for impact investing. As I understand, it was virgin territory at the time. It was pretty early on. Take me through that early work and what the landscape looked like back when impact investing was kind of this early primordial swirl.
It is a little bit later, although still a little while ago. So that's probably more towards 2013 or so when we would have been jumping into that work. And my own focus in the field came in around 2011 or so. It's both early and late. And this is something I've been reminded of often in our work. The actual fundamental work of community finance, microfinance, big areas that are closely related, kind of the ancestors of the thing that we've started to call impact investing in the last 10 or 15 years, have been going for many decades before. So in that sense, building on quite a lot of work and momentum, but pulling together at that time now, just a little over 10, 11 years ago, the different sets of actors almost for the first time to have a bit of a shared conversation about what is the opportunity going forward here. And so what was unique about those series of discussions is we had those leaders that have been doing decades worth of work in community and around the world on microfinance, housing, other areas of great importance. We had policy attention and leadership at that time from the Obama era White House. We had philanthropic leadership that, again, have been doing some of this work since the late 1960s with the PRI programs here in the United States. And so those folks all, to some degree, would have known each other. But then have, for the first time, some of the leaders from private capital coming to the table. And that really was the new piece of the equation, was saying, well, okay, wait a minute, what do markets need? What is actually going to be required to make these opportunities investable and to ultimately get to the kind of scale required to behave around the rules of capital markets versus the rules of philanthropy or policy or some of those other systems that folks were coming from. So it set a unique table for the first time to begin debating and engaging on how to build a field together.
You returned to Harvard for your MBA at the business school. At that point, what did you feel was missing from your toolkit that made you want to develop and choose to go back to school?
It was very specifically the business piece of the toolkit, because I had the policy background and experience from my undergrad days and volunteer. I had the social sector experience from my day job here at Bridgespan, where up until that point, I had mostly been doing more traditional philanthropy work and corporate philanthropy work. My now wife had at that point already started to go through law school, so I knew that was not the right path for me. So really the only thing left was business, but given that I was starting to poke into this world of impact investing, it made sense. There was kind of a different language that I didn't really yet know how to speak, and a different set of networks that I was not fully connected into. And so in a lot of ways, going back to my undergrad training, that sort of sociology mindset, it was a peek into a different world where I was not spending that much time of saying, how does this work? How does business leadership and investment leadership make decisions? And that was kind of the undertone of how I spent my time during my MBA years.
It was during the time of your studies in the business school that you did a summer stint at Google working on the Global Impact Awards program. Tell me about what you were doing for Google there, and then what did you learn from that experience?
It was the first time I think I'd ever drawn a paycheck from a proper for-profit. It was a chance to be in my comfort zone doing more of the philanthropy, social sector focus, hence the .org, but in a completely different context, given the trajectory and importance of Google. The effort that we were working on that summer was kind of this idea of the signature initiative of the Global Impact Awards, of what were some of the big ideas that Google could help back and help advance, particularly in places where either they would have a different perspective or maybe more willingness to embrace risk. And one of those that still sticks out for me was an early and significant grant to the Give Directly program, the unconditional cash transfer outfit that's done a lot of research and pioneering work around the world, and now actually back here in the US over the last handful of years. It was at that point a crazy idea. What if we just gave people cash to solve their problems? not that it hasn't been done before, but for a philanthropist to say, okay, my benchmark here is I have to do more good than just putting cash into someone's hands. And it was sort of a hard question to ask, to say, well, wait a minute, but I thought we were doing more than that. I thought we had the answer, and the humility to step back and say, well, what if we don't? What could that look like? That was a really interesting experience of helping, make the case for that and structure and set up that particular opportunity with the rest of the Google team.
Around 2011, which would have been around the time you were getting out of business school and this experience happened, you said that you were searching for the next intersection where friction between systems might be interesting to explore. Tell me about what was going on inside of you at that point. What were you thinking?
If you look over the type of work that I've done historically, I've had the privilege of and very much enjoy situations where there's a blank sheet of paper and a big question to be asked. And what I've found in those moments is that places where there are two existing systems, sort of like the tectonic plates, right? Like rubbing up against each other, is where some of the most interesting opportunities are to fill that blank page. In the earlier days of my time at Bridgespan, that was some really big corporate philanthropy initiatives where for the first time there were $100 million commitments being made by large philanthropy, which today in 2025 doesn't sound like much, but at that time was actually quite a pioneering step forward. Or a really intentional intersection between the policy world and the philanthropy world. Who is bridging to whom? What role are we playing? How are we focusing on evidence together? So those types of experiences were the things that I just found most professionally interesting. And that's what led me then into the impact investing field, sort of looking at this big map. I still have the slides somewhere. It's quite a thing of all these different kind of buzzwords and concepts of, are any of these things real? Was more or less the question that I was trying to ask. And is there a role that I can play in these? Is there a role that Bridgespan can play in these? That's what led me to, again, intersection between social environmental change and capital markets was the friction point. That was the opportunity. And the question is, right, does friction make heat or light? Hopefully it makes light at the end of the day. You're actually getting something productive out of this intersection. That's where I've been ever since.
But most people run from friction. In this case, you seem to actively seek it out. Where do you think that comes from? What is it about challenging spaces that draws you in?
I think it's maybe the sense that no one knows what the right answer is, but at the same time, you have to try. And that actually ends up being a really invigorating part of the process, because you are creating something that hasn't existed before. To frame it, I guess, in maybe a slightly different way, it suits well. I found I'm not much of an entrepreneur. I had one summer internship experience a long time ago in a very entrepreneurial environment. It was not a great place for me. It was the sort of the early days of like, okay, someone's got to fix the air conditioner, and like, how is it that we're going to pay ourselves again? And that was not really where I found myself to be at my best. As much as the phrase is slightly tortured, the idea of intrapreneurship has been, I think, much more my experience professionally. And that to me is the happy middle ground. Because in general, as a lot, consultants are not particularly a risk tolerant bunch, right? But the idea of finding just the right amount of risk, just the right amount of opportunity is what draws me to those points of friction between systems.
I want to talk about Bridgespan itself. Most people I speak with come out of school, and then I got to go through about 14 different jobs. You got out of school and you're still there.
One line on the resume. It's really simple.
I'm sure Bridgespan was really quite different in the early days, but why don't we talk about Bridgespan today for someone who's not familiar with it? Paint a high level picture for us of what Bridgespan is today, what the mission is, the scale of operations, geographic presence, types of clients you work with, and so forth.
We're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. And as you mentioned before, our original roots are in Bain & Company, where we were incubated originally. But Bridgespan is a completely separate organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit in the United States. And that is the umbrella for a global team of about 450 of us that are in Boston, New York, DC, San Francisco, Mumbai, Delhi, Joburg, and Singapore. We're covering a pretty wide swath of the market these days. And the work that we do is you can break down into a couple of different pieces. On one side of the house, we have our break-even consulting business, which is what we're mostly seen and known for. On the other side is our grant-funded knowledge and research business, where we're one of the largest publishers of social sector content and research in the world on that side. And the two of those are deeply connected to one another, where the insights we generate from our consulting work are designed to be shared as widely and broadly through our research processes as possible, which is, again, different than what you get in a for-profit model, where you make those proprietary, you capture them, you try to extract value from them. Our loop is to try to get them as public and as broadly accessible as quickly as possible. So back to what we actually do in that consulting business, we work on both sides of the ledger. So we work with folks who have capital and folks that use capital. On the use capital side, it's mostly nonprofits and NGOs, where it could be any number of ranges of issues, from public health to education to juvenile justice to livelihoods. And the questions there tend to be core strategy and operation questions. How do we increase our impact? How do we grow our business or opportunity? Or how do we respond to threats or cuts, which unfortunately has been a pretty big topic in the last 6 to 12 months. And then on the other side of the fence, with holders of capital, we work with impact investors in sort of their institutional form. So that could be the general partner side with the TPGs and Bain Capitals of the world. It could be on the limited side with some of the large global allocators that we support, or increasingly it could be on the family office side, which tend to be a more flexible kind of impact first flavor of impact investing. And that complements the remainder of what we do, which is actually still very much the majority. Impact investing is a small piece of the overall business, which focuses a lot on family philanthropy and on a collaborative philanthropy, where folks are coming together to find new ways to give.
You operate as a nonprofit, which gives you different freedoms than traditional consulting firms. How would you explain what Bridgespan does differently than maybe what a traditional consulting firm like McKinsey or Bain does, especially in the context of working with social sector clients?
The biggest piece that I would highlight is, at the end of the day, our fiduciary is to impact. There's no kind of bottom line benefit to us as an organization from doing the work. So the question that then becomes, is this work leading to better decisions, higher impact in the world, better outcomes for society, to the point of, if we're doing work that doesn't make sense, just even pulling back, and have had this happen a couple of times over the years, and say, I think we probably should stop. Right? This isn't working, right? Even if we're all relatively happy, if we're not actually doing work that's resulting in those changes in the world, it sort of doesn't matter. And so that ends up being the through line, which means that in those contexts, of course, you have to have, it's a consulting business, you have to have happy clients, but you have to have happy clients making hard decisions. And so I think that really does flow through, where a lot of the ethos and emphasis is on how do we, in a humane way, present that information to get those decisions that will ultimately benefit a completely different group of people, right? That's, versus a more traditional commercial environment where you have those feedback loops of customers, of sales cycles. We don't always have those feedback loops in the social or environmental context. So you have to figure out how to create them, how to manage that accountability, and how to use what data information we have to make the best decisions possible in that operating context.
I mostly have investors on this show. You're not an investor. You advise investors. I usually ask, what's the theory of change? What is Bridgespan's core thesis, or the equivalent of theory of change or whatever? I suppose there's certain types of projects you can say, that's us. I've always said that it's just as important to decide what you're not going to do as it is to decide what you're going to do, because working on something you shouldn't be doing is distracting for an organization. Can you articulate that so we can keep that in mind as we continue on here?
The idea that has always been in our mission and in articulation is this idea of breakthrough results, and focusing on whatever society and environment's most important challenges are. And that changes. It's a bit of a dynamic effort in any given 3-5 year period. What are the most pressing issues that are facing different regions and in different geographies? So we don't have, in that sense, a focus on a particular climate goal or a particular educational goal because we work across such a wide range of different topic areas. But the idea is, can you get to those breakthroughs, right? Not just the linear progress and change, but the step function change. That tends to be what we are looking for, are those kind of inflection points, because we're large, but we're small. For what we do, we're a relatively large organization, but against the scale of the need and the problems that we're seeking to tackle, we are tiny. And so that's why that idea of breakthrough and inflection becomes such an important factor there. And behind what that means in practical terms is it means a really deep focus on both leadership and then decision making. Is there a leader who can carry forward this work, drive the change that is part of the project? And is the organizational context ready to actually make those decisions, embrace the change, do things differently? That tends to be a big part of factoring in whether we are a good fit to help advance a client's.
But this is all in the context of capital deployment. This isn't just coming up with good ideas.
It has to lead to something being done in the world, and either deploying capital differently than had been deployed before, or managing it once it's deployed. If you put it in a sort of a standard portfolio context, like what are you doing in post-stack or value creation? What does that kind of portfolio engagement strategy look like? That's a big piece of the puzzle, alongside, did you get the allocation decision right to begin with, which is more of the diligence and underwriting side of the house.
You're looking for accountability and outcomes on the back end. What does accountability look like when the outcomes are social and environmental rather than purely financial?
At this point, the accountability is still largely self-imposed by the players in these markets, right? There have been steps forward in terms of the progress of what the regulatory environment has done for us, particularly in the European context. But we aren't yet at a point where there is a mandate or requirement that the actual social or environmental performance is really the central decision-making pillar, or anyone is held accountable to their performance at this point. And that in a lot of ways is the end point that we'd like to see here. We'd like to see an impact investing market that actually competes on impact, right? It's sort of a basic concept, but that's not where we are yet. And so right now in the institutional side, it's kind of that contract between LP and GP, right? LP says, I need something, right? I need a climate allocation. I need a social strategy. I need that to be emerging markets. I need it to be credit. I need to be private equity, whatever I need. And, GPs are responding and creating the products that align with that. So it's really just that kind of relationship right now that is creating the accountability, because there's not an outside factor that is enforcing it just yet.
And that's because also there's not standards either of measurement, or not universally adopted standards.
We've made progress, but we haven't reached a conclusion on a single way of answering those questions.
Bridgespan does significant work with nonprofits, but given the focus of this show, it's for investors seeking competitive returns. Now, I really want to drill down on your work with for-profit investors. And the first question on that is, how do you convince hard-nosed investors that they can achieve both impact and financial returns without compromising either one of those?
At this point, it's becoming the proof in the pudding, right? If we look at the funds now, getting to almost 10 years in total vintage that have been doing this work at meaningful institutional scale, right? So that's your Bains, your KKRs, your TPGs. They are getting to that vantage where they're showing relatively strong performance in those vintages. So that's the easiest way now. It was much harder 10 years ago to make that case. But stepping back from the specific track record data, the basic idea for a hard-nosed investor is that impact investing is just more data for your decision-making process. And it's kind of hard to imagine an investor that doesn't want more data, because you're asking a different set of questions, or at least you're asking questions in a different way than you normally would, which at its most basic level is the products and services of the businesses that we own or invest in. Do they make the world better or worse when they grow? And that is a relatively hard question to answer, easy to ask, hard to answer, but also relates to how those businesses are going to fare against some of the global mega trends and themes that will shape really the next chapters of any businesses going forward. And so it has to be through that lens that you're viewing the investment opportunity and context, because there's no market force that says either you have to create an impact investing fund if you're a GP, or you have to have an impact investing allocation as an LP. We're still, in the grand scheme of things, relatively early into this as an institutional grade strategy. So a lot of it comes down to leadership and that longer term trajectory to say, actually, I think that data, I think those trends are material. I think they matter. I'm going to pay attention to them, and I'm going to make them part of my strategy.
I sit in Europe, you're in America. There's a lot of people today, especially in America, throwing around terms ESG and impact investing and often using them interchangeably. There's been some so-called blowback on ESG in America, much more there, not so much here. You've been very clear that ESG integration is not the same as impact investing. So can you break that down for us so we're all singing off the same song sheet here? What's the fundamental difference between how environmental and social issues affect a company versus how a company affects the world, and why does this distinction matter so much?
I think your frame really does set up the layers of this, and I'll even add a third at the end. So the first layer of where ESG began is the question of how does society and environment affect the profitability of my business? If I'm a big consumer of water and there's going to be water scarcity or a water tax, you probably need to plan for that as a business owner. Or if you're in a flood-prone area, you probably need to think about resilience if you're building infrastructure that's supposed to last 50 to 100 years. So that's asking how are those forces going to affect me? And that's where we started with ESG. The second question is then, how does my business affect those things, right? How does my carbon footprint as a manufacturer affect the environment? How do my labor practices as an employer affect the people who work for me? That's kind of the second rung of ESG, which is, I think, where the center weight of good practice would sit in the market right now, is that question. Although still some folks are just even getting onto the first rung at this point. And then when you get to the last rung, we ask the question around impact, as I framed it before, is you're answering a slightly different question, which is how do the products or services of the business, not just the footprint, but kind of the handprint of the business, affecting society and the environment? Because there's a lot of businesses that actually have a relatively neutral footprint, right? Take like most SaaS businesses. There's a little bit of carbon coming from their data center use. There's a few people who are employed, usually relatively well. And that's the entire kind of ESG footprint of the business. But you have to ask then that second question of, okay, the technology, when it's used, does it have value to society? Is it an app that produces memes, right? And so you have to ask a very different set of questions to understand what's the value of that. Let's say it's a business that's creating a marketplace for insurance for micro and small entrepreneurs in an emerging economy. Does that matter? Does that help? Is there an access gap? Totally different set of questions.
Now let's discuss the analytical shortcomings in the field before frameworks existed, like the IMM framework, which you were part of developing, and we're going to drill down on shortly here. The financial world's universally accepted metrics like IRR, the internal rate of return, and the MOIC, the multiple on invested capital. And they use these for estimating financial yields, but there was no equivalent for evaluating social and environmental rewards in dollar terms. How big of a problem was this, and what were the consequences of not having standardized measurement tools?
You'll keep hearing me say probably two words throughout this, which is elements of leadership and decision-making. This one's all about decision-making. And really the question is then specific to who the decision makers are, but how do you put social or environmental value and consideration on firm and even footing with your financial decision-making processes? That's really where the question started about 11 years ago. And that's what led to the specific development of that impact multiple of money. Now, that said, that has not become the standard. There are a number of different ways of answering that question. And they really come back to what the needs and context of the decision maker are, right? And you can see this even within different investing firms, right? There are some that are very IRR driven. And that's a big piece of the emphasis. It's a headline in the memos and materials. Everyone produces an IRR, but some are very heavily weighted on that modeling and projection. Others are a little bit more qualitative, focused on leadership, focused on macro trends, focused on different dynamics. And so you just have to look inside of an organization and understand, how does any individual asset manager actually make decisions? Is it the loudest voice in the room? Is it consensus? Is it data? Is it stories? What's the mix of all of those things? And find a way to appropriately integrate this kind of parallel set of questions, not a set of later questions, but parallel questions about social or environmental impact. Because if you're to look at an investment decision-making process, so you have thesis development at the beginning. How do we integrate impact? Where are there opportunities where social or environmental progress aligns with highly investable theses? There are then sourcing questions. How do we source against those? Is it proprietary? Are we building individual networks to find the most unique opportunities? How does impact factor into those networks? And then from a framework perspective, screening is the first place that it really tends to show up, because investors have to be, to your point before, what you say no to is just as important as what you say yes to. They have to be really good at saying no, and saying no quickly, and saying these things don't fit our thesis. We don't see opportunity there. So how, again, do you make sure you're bringing an impact lens in there? Then into diligence, you're doing commercial diligence, financial diligence, impact diligence at the same time, so that when you're sitting in an investment committee, you can actually look at all the data together instead of making a financial decision and then saying, oh, maybe there's some impact in this business. Wouldn't that be nice? You have to make a decision that says, okay, there's a financial trajectory for this business and an impact trajectory. That checks our box, which you then bring into the post-ac and value creation process as an owner to say, how do I increase that? How do I maximize that? So all of those different stages are different moments of sense-making and decision-making where you need something, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, to integrate impact alongside your financial considerations.
But getting back to your other point about competing, there should be competition in the impact industry. If everyone's not using the same standards, then you don't really have a level playing field or the same playing field.
Yeah, I would separate, though, two different pieces of the equation, right? Where no one is looking for comparability in decision-making and underwriting standards, right? Like the fact that two different GPs make decisions differently on financial terms is pretty widely accepted. I mean, that's why you're looking at the track record and leadership of a firm. You're basically betting on them to make good decisions. But your point is well taken on the back end from a performance perspective. In the absence of consistent performance measures, it becomes very hard to say who's at the top of the league table and who's at the bottom of the league table from a climate or social perspective. And I do think that's a persistent gap.
Now enter impact multiple of money framework, which we'll refer to as IMM, which you co-developed with the TPG Rise Fund, which is Maya Kringle, was on the show about a year ago and a friend of the podcast. And that's her fund. And this IMM framework is now kind of often referred to as kind of a gold standard, so to speak, in the business. So take me through the origin story of the IMM framework. Explain what it is at a high level for now. We'll drill down on it in a minute, and explain how it differed from the other impact measurement frameworks that existed at the time.
The quick sketch of what it is a way of understanding how the outputs of a business, again, back to those products and services before, have positive or negative value to society and the environment using a whole bunch of research in the middle. And when we were developing it, it was again in response back to decision making to a need to understand for prospective investors, how is it that a shop like a Texas Pacific Group or TPG has never really done impact before? how is it that we know and can trust that they are doing the impact thing that they said they were going to do? And again, it's a very simple way of putting it, but that was kind of the dynamic, was how do we do that? And how do we do that for a fund that's targeting 7 sectors globally that functionally relate to 80% of global GDP, covering diverse issues and investment theses and approaches? How do we do that? That was the starting point. And when we looked out at what was available, there was thankfully, again, kind of like we referenced before, the forebears who'd done good work in community development and microfinance and other places, a good big body of research around social return on investment and the use of social value as a policy decision-making tool. We just hadn't seen very much of that get translated into investor context and into investor speak, honestly. Back to those big pools of research, those are academic speak, right? That's sitting in JSTOR and big databases that academics use. It's not sitting on Bloomberg terminals. So a lot of this is really about translation to the right audience, to the right frame for purposes of decision making, and to be able to show, not tell, to those allocators who are interested in these opportunities, how is it that this particular option is an actual impact investment, meets the thresholds and criteria that your asset manager is laying out to you? So it needed to solve for all of those things. And so what I think was most different about it, other than the use of a lot of research, is the focus on ex ante versus ex post. It's very different to look back at an investment and say, did any good come from this, than it is to look at a prospective investment and say, what is the good that we expect to come from this? And will we hold ourselves accountable to that? So that was one of the big shifts. And another was ensuring that both sides of the ledger were accounted for here, both what were the positives, but also what were the potential negatives associated with this business.
TPG's a serious private equity firm. On the other hand, the Rise Fund is why Maya went there, if my recollection is right. So there wasn't this skill in-house, to my knowledge. Were you brought in from the beginning, or did they come to you and say, we need this? Or was there a particular aha moment when you and the TPG team kind of came up with this? Or was this driven by LPs?
We had the privilege of basically being the first folks in the door with the TPG team, just as Maya was coming on board. And as this idea of saying, gee, can we really create a proper institutional scale private equity impact investing product? Because there have been a lot of successes in more of the venture capital stages with some interesting impact investing opportunities, including where Maya was previously to going over to TPG. But there hadn't yet been something, right? I mean, as your audience knows, right? It's that basic economics problem. You're not institutional until you're $1 billion, and particularly even 10 years ago. It's probably a little bigger now, because institutions don't want to write checks smaller than 50 to 100, and really they'd like to write 250 or above. So you just can't get there with the fund concentration limits. That's our limiting factor, where everything in market up until that point, I think with the exception of being Capital Double Impact, which came just a little bit earlier, had been in that 100, 200, maybe 250 range. One or two in microfinance had gotten to be a little bit bigger, but no one had really taken on this bigger question. And so again, back to leadership, firm leadership at TPG was really interested in this, and including Jim Coulter, who's still very involved with the Rise platform. And that idea that there was commitment, there was an idea, an opportunity to test and develop something. It was a process very much of co-creation. And our role in that, obviously, it wasn't to do the thesis development or tell TPG how to invest, right? We're not investors, but it was to bring in that impact side of the equation and say, this hasn't really been done before. We're still facing a lot of skepticism, back to your earlier question of how do you convince a hard-nosed investor that this impact thing is worth looking at? Let's try. Let's see what we can do here. And so in that sense, again, we weren't really at a point where you could say there is firm market data. We're responding to existing demand, but much more a sense of opportunity and creation of demand by building a vehicle at scale that had super high integrity from the start around what its impact performance was going to be.
But isn't the genius of the IMM that was different? It seems to measure impact before capital's deployed? And if I've got that right, why is that temporal shift so crucial?
It comes back to the actual kind of written definition of impact investing. One of the words in there that you can skip over if you're reading it quickly is the intent to create measurable social and environmental progress. And the idea of knowing intent is what was good when you came into the business, right? What did you expect the value or benefit to be? Just like you would project your expectations of financial performance and business performance, it is saying, well, we also have to project the potential for impact performance. And this is, I think, also very much a novelty of moving from venture into growth equity, even starting to get into buyout a little bit, because venture, it's much harder, as we all know, to project performance, right? It's a little bit of wild guess.
That's a hockey stick.
You're projecting off of very limited data. It's much harder to do this kind of forward-looking projection around impact in those contexts. And as you get into growth businesses, right, like your post-revenue, really for the scale of a TBG, you're profitable and you're looking for rocket fuel to put into the ship to get to this next phase of scale and growth and impact. And so you're also dealing with just a lot more data and a lot more substantive of an underwriting process. So it's partially a factor of the investment stage and context, and partially a factor of taking an established investor and having to build that credibility and that new muscle around impact that both internally folks within the firm could understand how to do it, but also externally allocators who are considering it would say, okay, I believe that you're doing that. I see how you're doing that.
Earlier, you referred to a concept of impact underwriting. Is that putting social and environmental impact estimation on the same footing as financial underwriting? And if so, what does that look like when you're sitting across the table from the investment committee?
It's very much taking whatever the investment base case might be, looking really at the sort of the end of the sheet, not at the IRR projection, but at the widgets, right? What are the outputs or activities of this business? And then from there, trying to test out and say, what's the positive or negative social or environmental implication of that? And how is that going to grow over time? Is it just going to grow in lockstep with the overall growth of the business? Or again, for more of the private equity crowd, is it going to line up with your sort of EBITDA waterfall in all your value creation activities? Where you'd say, actually, things we're doing to this business are going to further push that curve up and create more social or environmental value than we might have originally projected at time of entry.
Walk me through the 6-step IMM methodology. And I want to understand both the technical framework and the philosophical choices that are embedded in each step. Where do you make assumptions and how do you stress test assumptions and so forth? But do it in a way someone listening to this on the tube in London can understand. Don't put a Excel eye chart with 1,400 columns on. Walk us through this.
We'll start with where we just left off in that last part of the conversation about the widgets of the business. And this is that first, what's the relevance and scale of this platform? What are its outputs and business activities that could either be good or bad for the world? And sometimes we shorthand this as kind of like impact theses or impact pathways. And a business could have a handful of those, but not an infinite number. You're not looking at full kind of accounting for absolutely every positive thing and absolutely every negative thing a business has ever done, but rather, what are the big 3 positive drivers? What are the big 3 negative drivers? So taking something like a Dodla Dairy, which is one of the earlier TPG investments. Okay, it's 220,000 farmers. We know that over the potential investment period, it's 2.6 billion liters of milk that would be purchased from those farmers. And we know because they would be buying milk that those farmers otherwise have to throw away in the wet season, that results in a roughly projected 73% income increase, going from $425 a month to $735. So that kind of gives you a sense of what's that starting point. And this is all just business data, right? This is not impact data yet. It's just business data. What are we talking about? What are the benefits? And then on the negative side for something like that, it's cows. So cows produce methane. So how much methane are they producing? And so you're balancing out both sides of the sheet. And then from that, you're already starting to do the second step, which is identifying the target social or environmental outcomes, where in this case, we're really looking to say, do those smallholder farmers who are getting by on very modest incomes, do their families benefit from an income uplift? Do they make more money, which is what we just talked about before? So that's the big headline that you want to pay attention to on that side. And then on the other side, given it's, again, farming, want to make sure that the carbon footprint of that doesn't go up and sort of rocket ship and dump a bunch of additional carbon out into the world. That's where we start with those kind of individual units. The third step is then to estimate the economic value of those outcomes to society. Now, in this case, you actually don't have to do much translation when you're talking about income. But on the carbon side, we'd often use what's called the social cost of carbon to estimate what are the effects of another metric ton of carbon being emitted on the world. How much does that cost society? So you're able to turn that back to a more quantitative figure. I'll use a different example here to illustrate how do we translate the outcomes side of things. This is a business called Acorns, which was also a relatively early TPG investment, which was one of those early non-bank financial institutions that was designed to create positive saving habits among lower income Americans. And the thing was, we actually didn't know at that time, like, what were the values of savings. It's one of those intuitive things where it's sort of like having clean water is a good thing. Yes. Finding the research that says that, oddly quite hard, because it sounds almost so straightforward that you think it might not have been researched. But what we did find out was looking for some secondary research that said that use of payday loans, which is, super expensive way of borrowing money for lower income Americans, goes down if there's any savings in place. So we sort of use that as a way back in to figure out, okay, there is a financial benefit here, and start to translate that back into dollar terms of what's the value of saving $1? What's the value of saving $100? It actually results in lower borrowing costs and specific value to these families. So this is the first kind of turn of the loop in the first three steps, is taking the widgets, the business outputs, going to the research, figuring out what's the value of those outputs. Is there evidence that individual humans or the environment benefits or suffers as a result of that? And turning that into a quantitative value of the kind of net positive benefit of a business, or net negative, although in that case, the investment's not getting done. From there, the rest of it is a set of steps to translate it out into a multiple figure. So the first of those is a risk adjustment. And in here, we're not talking about business risk, because that's already been accounted for in the widgets, the base case of the business. We're talking about impact risk. And there, part of it is looking at the quality of the research. How much do we have to translate it? How close is it to the actual intervention that we're looking at? And others are a little bit more focused on the operations of the business. Like, is there a risk that a business that is targeting originally lower income consumers or smallholder farmers shifts and goes up to serve higher income consumers, higher income farmers? What's the risk of those types of shifts happening? So we add that as basically a discount factor to be a little bit conservative around the direction of the projection. And then from there, the last two steps are the simplest and the most consistent for anyone who'd be doing a financial model. You put a terminal value onto the back end of it, say, really emphasize what's the value during ownership, during hold, project from there of how have you shifted the trajectory of the business, because you're not going to own it forever. What's the value in the back end with an appropriately high discount rate? And then coming down to the last step, it's a multiple. So you got to divide it by the capital deployed and the share of the business. So it gives you a frame of reference to say, is this a high multiple business where, if I put in $10 million of capital, we're creating $50 million of social environmental value? Or is this a low business where you put in $10 million worth of capital and you're only seeing $11 million worth of value to society and the environment? So it just gives you a kind of horizon line and heuristic to make sense of the difference between really high value and lower value, or even in some cases, net negative value businesses.
And where are these values coming from?
So they're coming from the original projection of how many outputs the business is producing, then the translation of those outputs into some type of social outcome. Again, that could be educational attainment. It could be reduction in improvement in quality adjusted life years and health, or it could be a direct financial benefit of improving the income of a family. And then in cases where that is not already expressed as a dollar, turning it into a dollar from research in public health and in climate and in other fields. That is what gives you the sort of numerator in that equation, is that little piece of math outputs into social impacts into quantitative dollars. So it's kind of three pieces of the top of the equation, then divided by the amount of capital you've deployed on the bottom.
Doesn't this force you to somehow grapple with some moral and ethical questions? Like, how do you assign dollar values to human lives in different countries? How do you put price tags on social outcomes?
There both remains a bit of moral hazard and complexity to that, but also a broader field that we sort of lean on and borrow from. We're not first persons to have to ask that particular question. There's maybe two different layers to it that are worth looking at. The first is just period, how do you assign a dollar value to health benefits to a life? And that is something that policy decision makers have already chosen to do. And so we basically have said, we're going to just follow that existing path and line of logic where, the DOT in the United States and other agencies have assigned the idea of a value of a statistical life, which is it sounds a bit cold-blooded when you say it out loud, but it's used in other decision making, like what decisions can reduce traffic fatalities from a policy perspective. And they're trying to understand basically the cost benefit of different policies and which ones are going to create greatest value for society. And so that type of work is being done by economists, researchers, policymakers to start to assign those values, and tend to want to rely on what's already being done by that audience rather than trying to reinterrogate it. And it's a completely legitimate, I think, factor for some folks to say, actually, I don't want to do that. That doesn't work for me. That's not part of my investment strategy. I'm not comfortable with that. You can stop a step before that and just say, how many lives did you save? And you don't have to turn it into that dollar value as long as you can use that information a step prior, which is what we've seen a large number of investors choose to do in the interceding 10 years is stopping at that first step, translating business output into, positive impact and saying that's good enough. I know if not just how many folks got access to hospital beds, that's not really good enough, but what was the health benefit of those folks getting access to those hospital beds? I'm going to stop there. So that's that, and I think that's still a totally reasonable perspective and point of debate. The second that comes up, because you did mention, is how do you do that across different geographic contexts? That one tends to actually work out a little bit more in the math, where the cost of serving or creating a benefit in different economies varies quite wildly. If you're doing it on a relative basis, because it's numerator and denominator, it actually tends to work out because you are serving so many more people in economies that have higher or lower purchasing parity than more developed economies. You end up with less of a moral hazard in doing that, but it's a little bit hard to believe until you've actually done the math yourself once or twice and said, oh, okay, actually, this is not just saying only invest in wealthy economies where statisticians would say the quote unquote value of a statistical life is higher. It doesn't actually result in that particular moral hazard as an outcome of the math.
How ubiquitous is this IMM framework? How many companies are deploying it?
It's deployed across the double-digit billion-dollar portfolio of the TPG platform, which is both the Rise funds and the Rise climate funds at this point in time, so that they are the biggest user at this point. But we can point to other examples around the world where it's been adapted a bit to suit different needs and contexts. One in the context in Africa, Africa Invest, the largest, oldest private equity firm on the continent, has adapted into a multiple of impact for their portfolio to better communicate the value from an impact perspective across pretty diverse investment contexts. We're doing some work right now with an investor in India that is trying to do the same thing at slightly earlier stages of investment. So there are individual examples of that kind of replication and adoption, but definitely not kind of an accepted industry standard or something that has been solely replicated, rather a bit more of an open source concept that can be adapted as needed to varying.
It is open source?
Yeah, it's open source in the sense that, right, it's out on Harvard Business Review. There's an article detailing it, and then a couple of HBS case studies that go through the math and mechanics behind it. The underpinnings of it are pretty widely available.
You mentioned a little earlier that you also worked with Bain Capital's Double Impact Fund. What was your approach or your experience that you had there that might have informed institutional impact investing?
That was the very first of the brand name institutions from the private equity world to jump into this space. They were a little bit ahead, I think 18 odd months of TPG. And so there, the questions were even more fundamental. How do you convince the hard-nosed investor of this? There was a lot of confusion. We had the privilege of doing that with Governor Deval Patrick. A conversation where we just sat down and folks said, is this philanthropy? What is this exactly? And trying to say, well, no, it's not. Let's point again to these examples and housing, microfinance, it's been done before. It's not brand new. We're building on an idea that's actually been around for quite a while, but in the halls of institutional private equity and large scale global asset allocation, it was sort of this like head scratcher. What exactly are you trying to do here? Particularly around the idea of delivering market rate returns and some quantum of impact benefit. So that ended up being really a big piece of the equation, was just proofing that out and making sense around the investment theses. What were the areas, and that's a fund that only invests in the US, but what were the areas where there was a gap, where there was an opportunity that, again, going back to this kind of research question, we're like, oh yeah, we could see there being some commercial value and benefit here. Things like systems that involve large public payers like Medicare or Medicaid in the US paying for health benefits for folks who otherwise might not have access to quality care, or similarly on the educational side, service providers into public educational institutions. How are those producing benefits? Some of those just very fundamental questions of how do we proof this out and say it's more than just like a feel-good business story. It's not just philanthropy. It's something that's driving both of those at the same time.
You've written quite a bit about impact first investing, and particularly in a piece you wrote called Back to the Frontier, Investing that Puts Impact First. How do you define impact first as an asset class? And maybe you can describe where it sits between traditional philanthropy that expects no financial return and finance first impact investing that demands market rate returns?
It's probably a bit more of a style than an asset class, because it crosses so many different actual investment approaches. But the basic idea is it's a style of investing that puts the purpose or problem solving goal first. So really the question that you're answering is this investment going to result in the amount of carbon mitigation that I want to see? Is it going to result in the amount of educational benefit that I think is going to be most meaningful to those target audiences? And then again, it's why we sort of use the simple moniker of impact first from an old Monitor report in the late 2000s is because it's just literally the first diligence question is the impact question. And then you go to your financial diligence to say, well, okay, what are the returns that are going to be associated with that? Is this a place where I could still actually make pretty compelling risk-adjusted returns and feel pretty happy about that? Is this a place where I can still make great returns, but I'm going to have to accept some type of disproportionate risk, whether that's time horizon, currency, country, technology, whatever of the usual set of factorable risks? Is this a place where I'm going to be lucky to just get my cash back, which sometimes on the credit side, you're saying, gee, what I'm doing here is just reducing cost of borrowing and making it easier for a broader audience to access capital. So, gee, maybe that's a good deal. Or actually, am I going to be happy if I just don't completely lose my shirt and I get 70 cents on the dollar? Because I'm going deep into the curve. I'm going to the end of the dusty dirt road. It's going to get really messy. I'm okay with that because 70 cents on the dollar is 70 cents more than 0 cents on the dollar of just giving it away. So it's that whole spectrum. And really, it just has to be in service of the first question of, did you get the social environmental benefit you were looking for? And then if yes, then you construct your portfolio accordingly on the financial side.
You've spent a considerable time on what you've referred to as the messy middle, particularly working with family offices. What does the messy middle look like operationally? And tell me how you structure things for investments in this space.
It's something that really starts again with that kind of purpose. What's the objective that the family is trying to accomplish? And the reason why we've seen this growth on the family side is because families just have that flexibility, right? There's no ERISA fiduciary duty that the Department of Labor is looking at to say you should or shouldn't be making this investment. There's no prudent investment standards for, endowed institutions that you have to respond to. So it really actually takes away all of those constraints and just says, what are you trying to do here? And what is the best way of accomplishing that? And once that is clear, that kind of objective set, purpose, function, why you exist, the next piece is not the sexiest, but is really critical, is you got to get the governance and decision making right. You have to be really clear on how you're going to make those decisions, who's going to make those decisions, how that's going to intersect with the rest of your family office strategy and structure. Does it sit with your existing advisor or CIO? Do you carve it out and put it into a separate box or bucket? Lots of different ways to think about how to actually get the decision-making mechanics right. And then from there, just moving into very much a kind of a learn by doing approach, where one of the big shifts we've seen in this space, particularly in the last 5 odd years, is away from a sense of, oh gosh, the only way I can do this type of work is if I build out, the Omidyar network was a good example of this, a whole team of 150 people to go do this on my behalf. And wow, that seems like a lot because you're basically standing up a proprietary asset manager at that point, to a place now where families have a wider range of funds and professionally managed opportunities that are built for this purpose. They're not built for pension funds to invest into, but they are built for family offices, in some cases endowments, in some cases development finance institutions, to get further into that risk curve and to solve a different set of problems.
What are the biggest misconceptions you encounter when you're working with clients who are new to impact first investing? Are there any places where people consistently get it wrong?
The biggest stumbling block is often a perception that somehow this is bad investing or concessionary investing, which, to be fair, is I think a lesson that was learned over the last 15 years by some of the pioneers in this space, where they did go into markets and contexts where their investment activity did in some cases prop up businesses or inflate prices or have unintended market dynamics that they could then never exit, right? Where there's nobody else to come in and take that afterwards. Unfortunately, some of those businesses have failed for obvious reasons, but that kind of first round of learning those lessons, I think, is very much informed the sense that at the end of the day, you still do need a strong commercial engine in order to get to the scalability that you're looking for. It's just that strong commercial engine isn't necessarily going to fulfill the 30+% IRR target threshold that a more commercial platform is going to require. There's a lot of opportunities that sit between a low single-digit IRR and the threshold that more commercial investors really need to be anchored on.
Did you work with Michael O'Leary? He was one of the founders there. He's now at Al Caterton. I've had him on the show a while back. Good guy. So one of the most challenging areas in impact is public equity impact investing. Our mutual friend, Eric Rice, told me that you were the one person that could discuss this subject and make it interesting. So now you're on the spot and I've built you up here. How does Bridgespan approach public equity impact investing? And maybe you can start this off by explaining a question I get all the time. How can buying and selling shares on the secondary market actually result in impact outcomes?
This remains still a bit of the wild west of impact investing. And I know Eric and others have pushed us forward in that regard. But we also have not seen super broad adoption of it. The easiest answer to the question is the one that you don't want me to answer, which is well, the proprietary capital side is actually the easiest, right? There's a bunch of opportunities that fall into that. A lot of emerging markets, listed equities would still hit that criteria. But then when you jump over to, more liquid markets and more developed markets, it does get a lot harder to establish. There's a couple of different approaches that you can think about taking there. Again, I'm going sort of easiest to hardest. If you're in a more liquid context, is still basically quasi-private style investing. So short pick lists, long holds, proprietary research, where you're taking all the tools that you'd be using as a private investor, but you're using it in a more liquid context to say, okay, I'm really sure of this business, what its benefits are, what my exposure is, and why I like the growth trajectory associated with that. So that starts to kind of click you in the right direction. Then when you get outside of the territory of proprietary pick lists, you're then really down to only having a couple of tools left at your disposal as a listed investor. One of those is still your fundamental diligence. The reason why it's easier if you're a pick list person is you've already done a lot of it when the position becomes available. If you're not, you've got to scramble and move pretty fast because most of these signals and information aren't widely available. Again, you can't pull them off of Bloomberg. So you have to have a rigorous and pretty disciplined way of getting through very quick diligence to make a decision, because your tools after you have executed the trade are much more limited. So unlike in a private context where you have more informal influence or 51% ownership in a lot of cases, you just don't have that whole toolkit, a much shorter toolkit that we'll get to in a second. So you basically have to make sure you picked right to begin with, and really getting that piece right matters a lot. Then after that, you're down to the engagement strategy, where you have to ask, what's my an activist here? Is that actually how I'm seeking to engage here? Or am I just generally an engaged shareholder? Do I have other interventions with management that may be beneficial? So all the standard set of engagement tools that you have as a listed investor. So it kind of turns the volume up on both that diligence and that engagement toolkit in order to say, I'm really sure both that I have bought what I thought I did and that thing is going to have some benefit. And then really the second half, which is still much harder to establish and prove, that my deployment of capital is actually having a differential benefit. That's very hard to establish in a listed context without an exceptionally strong engagement strategy, or back to the easy way of just proprietary capital.
Do you adopt IMM style thinking to public markets where you're essentially a small fish in a very big pond?
We've done the run through on it, and it really does help answer that first question, which is the alignment question of, are we sure we're buying what we thought we bought? The places where it gets a little bit trickier is when you're getting into much larger diversified portfolios. Before I was describing, when you get to growth equity, all of a sudden you have access to so much more information and certainty than you do when you're in venture. On the flip side of that, when you get to large publicly traded businesses, you have more information than you ever wanted. I remember one time we did this as a kind of proof of concept just based on public information, taking a look at Danone. And by the time you're done drawing out the kind of aggregate tree of all of the different SKUs and business units, you have a pretty complicated set of questions on your hands. And so really getting down to what are the most essentials, right? Again, which are the business units? That time they happened to own some businesses that were providing targeted nutrition to hospitals and oncology patients. So that was a really interesting one. There were a number of standard fare healthy eating businesses, some of which actually did have evidence of positive benefit, others of which a little bit more focus on marketing than positive benefit. And then a large portion of the business that really was hard to say, is there a positive benefit to the remainder of these business activities? Bottled water, for example, there's a slight negative environmental footprint, there's no positive footprint associated with it. How do you think about treating that? So it gives you, again, the mental model or framework to go and answer those questions of what do I like about this business? Where do I have reservations about this business? And it relates to some of the work that Sarani Cohen and other folks have done around impact-weighted accounting and the idea of trying to do that much more holistic look, particularly for later stage and larger scale global publicly traded businesses, to get that sense of, does the overall operation of this business create good for the world or create net harm?
Talk us through another concept of yours, which is capital stack alignment. How can commercial investors, catalytic capital investors, and philanthropic capital, how can they work better together to de-risk innovation and scale solutions?
A way that I've found can be helpful to put it for more traditional investors is it's really almost a flavor of structured finance, where you're looking to say, what are the underlying attributes or characteristic of the asset or project at the end of the road, and what is the right way of aligning capital against that to meet the fundamental risk return profile of that specific activity. There's an example here in the US, the Equitable Facilities Fund, which had a very simple version of that thesis. Again, this is one of those things where it's Occam's razor. Simplicity is, in fact, the critical element of success here, which was that charter schools in the US have to pay an awful lot of money to mortgage or rent their buildings. And every dollar that they pay to mortgage or rent their buildings is not going back into the classroom to benefit students. And this was pioneered and backed by the Walton family originally. And so they put up a large chunk of philanthropic capital to prove the idea out and to ultimately get that facility to the scale where it is now, multiple billions of dollars, that accesses traditional commercial paper, ultimately underwrites the loans at well below what the market would underwrite them, because they understand fundamentally these charter schools are getting paid by states for every student who sits in a seat. States usually pay their bills. And traditional mortgage underwriters just don't know what to do with that, right? They're not in the business of understanding charter finance and educational finance in, Missouri to Massachusetts. They don't want to do that. And so the risk was priced wrong. They were getting charged too much, and they just created a specialized product that kind of closes that loop and creates effectively a structured product that meets those needs. So again, very targeted to context. That tends to be where it works best, is aligning the interests and needs of different stakeholders to establish something, buy down risk, buy down price, and get it to fit into the existing mechanics of capital markets.
There seems to be a current trend where climate-focused funds are attracting a disproportionate amount of investment compared to social impact funds. Is this somehow creating a zero-sum dynamic out there? And how do you maintain momentum on social issues while capital flows towards climate solutions?
I don't think it's zero-sum as much as the foot's been on the gas a lot harder and a lot faster into climate in the last 5 or 6 years. And back to one of the points we talked about earlier, that's partially because climate's a little bit easier to understand what is the prospective benefit of a climate investment. And we've kind of gotten to a point where there's a broad agreement that a version of metric tons of carbon dioxide is kind of the lingua franca of climate investing. Now, anyone who's actually a climate investor will then poke lots of holes into the intricacies and specifics behind that. But what they're not arguing is that that is a really critical headline. In lots of other areas across the other side of the fence and the social domain, we can't even quite agree on what good looks like yet. And so despite, let's say, in education or public health or other fields that have scores of research and lots of good work and thinking from NGOs and investors, that we just haven't even reached that headline yet. So it becomes much harder to understand and articulate to a prospective investor, what's the benefit you're getting from this? And so I do think that's where we have this sort of uneven balance right now. Something that is very urgent and a little bit easier to understand as a layperson on the climate side. Something that's equally urgent, but much harder to understand within various elements of social. The question or pressure here is, well, how do we catch up? What are the steps forward that are needed to get some of those other investment theses on a level playing field with a climate from a clarity and urgency perspective?
Do you find yourself in situations with clients trying to help them think about interconnections between climate and social impact rather than treating them as separate silos?
In some cases, yes, because you're really looking at what are the effects of climate change on often highly marginalized populations. So there tends to be a lot of flow from climate back to social, which is how do the two of those things interrelate with one another. But at the same time, I think if we're being fully intellectually honest about it, there are also a bunch of social domains that really don't have a particularly strong intersection with climate, like the basics of education, let's say, as an example. Will there ultimately be intersections? Yes, of course, right? If schools are flooded and if children aren't able to access education, but it actually overlooks the more fundamental question, which is that we can't quite figure out how to improve educational outcomes in many contexts of the world, if not all, on a consistent and repeatable basis, even without trying to solve the climate elements. It's a little bit of a both directions matter, but also trying not to lose the clarity and specificity of there still being some really hard questions, even independent of the intersection between the two.
Let's talk a minute about fiduciary duty. The traditional interpretation focuses on maximizing financial returns for beneficiaries. You argue for a broader definition that incorporates system level risks and stakeholder values. Make the case for why the definition of fiduciary duty needs to evolve.
I think it's a question of time horizon. And you see this in the behaviors of both some of the world's largest asset allocators who both see themselves as universal owners, right? They have to be accountable for the whole system, and really long-term owners where they're not just worried about meeting their payout for the next 5 or 10 years to, let's say, their pensioners, but they're worried about pensioners 100 years from now and saying at that level, what is the future of markets, of capital, of capitalism? What is our responsibility? What does our license to operate look like? My personal observation is I strongly suspect that is one of the reasons why we've seen insurance companies be among the more innovative in this space, because fundamentally in their DNA, they really understand time. And they understand the dynamics of risk over much longer periods of time than more financially constructed institutions tend to, because they have to be looking at things that are very hard to even get your head around. Where are we going to be 50 years from now, let alone 100 years from now? That's where those concepts that we're introducing of, stakeholder value, the systems that we operate in become much more salient and much more material. Back to, again, that really simple definition of impact investing, which is all you're doing is adding more information to your decision-making process. You're taking a 50-year time horizon. You want every scrap of information you can possibly get access to, because those are the things that are going to make a difference to your ability to sustain performance in the long run.
But how would you respond to an institutional investor who genuinely believes that impact investing violates their fiduciary responsibility? What's your strongest counter argument to them?
The lack of data that there's any cost to doing this. You're saying the basic premise is just adding the information to your decision-making process. Your decision-making process can still result in a no along the way in terms of whether an investment is aligned with the needs and structure of your overall portfolio. But I can't see why you wouldn't want to factor in additional information when you're making a decision.
Given the current political environment and the backlash against ESG in America, how do you advise clients to navigate this politicized landscape while still maintaining their impact focus and commitments?
A lot of it comes back to that kind of second chunk of where we were before with the impact multiple, this idea of what's the data tell you? What's the research tell you? And again, if you're going to be making a decision on any longer term time horizon about, let's say, infrastructure, you're probably going to be looking at the effects of ocean level rise and temperature rise on that. You're going to be wanting to understand how supply chains are going to evolve. If you're in financial services, and we've seen concrete cases of this from some large leading financial services institutions, you actually do care about income inequality because it has effects on your bottom line and your ability to reach all different segments of consumers around the world. It comes back to just following what the data and what the trends are. Because again, when we're looking at this from an institutional perspective, a lot of where impact investing has been and is likely continued to head in the near term is really strong thematic global megatrend investing, and both anticipating and responding to those trends a little bit earlier. It creates value for investors, but also creates resilience for those businesses in the long and medium term.
Now, you've been at Bridgespan since 2006, and it's also interesting because you've been in a consulting capacity, but you've been in the same company all during this evolution of impact investing and what I'd refer to as the ongoing maturation of the field, because you've been there since early doors, and it was not much at the beginning, and now it's kind of morphed into a pretty large industry. What does excellence look like now as new actors enter and we're getting various scales and scopes? And do you think we're going to see increasing specialization by sector, or do you think generalist funds will continue to dominate?
I do think excellence is still very much about leadership and being clear about what it is that you're accomplishing in the market. The clearer you can be, the easier it is to hold yourself accountable to that, and the easier it is for your investors to ultimately hold you accountable. In the medium term, I would have to guess we would see some more specialization. It's just the way that alts have evolved, generally speaking, and most of impact investing is in alts. So therefore, you would kind of expect that the same way we've seen that specialization where you've got your CPG team here, you've got your healthcare team there, that you'd start to see a little bit more of that in the impact investing market. The tricky part, back to the economics, is we aren't yet at a point where we've seen that kind of breakthrough scale, the $500 to $700 million funds outside of climate really getting traction. And so that's where I think we're in a bit of a chicken and egg, where for a while we need generalist funds to continue learning, continue developing, continue working at scale, not just through growth, but even to early buyout of businesses that have really strong track records and really strong potential to continue delivering, specifically on the social value side, while we get to a point where it's actually possible to start launching those 500, 700 million, billion-dollar vehicles in more specialized domains. Hard to tell, given the headwinds that alts have faced, generally speaking, in the last 36 months, how long it might be before we start to see some of that happening. But it's kind of those awkward teenage years right now where not quite fully grown, but not in those early childhood years anymore either.
Braces and horn rim glasses. What's surprised you the most about how the industry's evolved over your time there? And did you have any expectations or predictions that just were completely off?
I just have to say it again, is how much it still relies on individual leaders to drive forward and make progress, where we're not fully at the point where market forces have cleared all of this and it's smooth sailing and the market will just grow by itself and reach that full potential of delivering scaled social environmental impact. It is still individuals within firms, on platforms, looking for bold steps forward. And that's on both the allocator side and on the manager side, to recognize where there are gaps and where there are opportunities to start doing things differently. Because really, some of this is just a shift in orthodoxy, where these sets of questions had not ever been asked before. They are being asked. They are informing decisions. And so we're still figuring out, we're kind of in the private equity of the early 80s from a maturity perspective. So we still have a lot to learn, and we need individuals that are spotting and driving that forward. I would have expected that we would have seen a much faster move into credit than we have, let's say. We're actually just in the middle of a pretty strong wave in the last 18 months. But you could have talked to me 5 years ago and I would have been saying, where's credit? Credit's got to be next. It's got to be coming. And I would have been wrong by nearly 5 years. So there's little things like that along the way. And again, it's been leadership that's driven that forward. One large allocator has been pushing forward a lot of credit strategies in the European context, and managers are responding with different ways of elevating meaningful credit opportunities. It took that alchemy of right place, right time, right person, or institution in this case, saying, let's make this happen. And now all of a sudden we have a strong batch of opportunities across the European market that didn't exist 24 months ago.
You've worked with some of the world's largest private equity funds. Be brutally honest with me. How much of what gets labeled as impact investing is actually just marketing spin?
It used to be a lot more than it is today because LPs have gotten smart. That's kind of what it comes down to, is if you're going to put a product out that's got an impact label on it, you're going to be sitting in front of the impact allocator at one of those, large European or US pension funds, or maybe, one of the Japanese, and having to say, all right, I know you've seen all these other pitch decks. I know you're in a couple of these other funds. They do all this work. What are you doing? It becomes a show, not tell kind of experience. And we've collaborated over the years with some placement agents as well, who often introduce us in the early stages to some of their clients and say, okay, we need to have a chat. This client thinks they want to launch an impact fund. We need to help them understand what that actually is and what is going to be demanded of them in order to actually get those allocations filled. There's a little bit more kind of collective market intelligence, which is, if you just put it on the label, that's not going to get your allocation filled. You're going to have a bunch of hard questions and a long, slow, painful, if ever successful fundraise. So the market has started to correct around some of that, not all of it. Definitely not all of it, because sometimes somebody just likes a manager, they're already exposed, they get into the next product, they don't think that much about it. But there are a few actors that are pushing harder on those questions, but none that are actually really reaching for the stars and saying, but who's the best? That's the thing that I think is still most missing, is allocators and others with influence saying, I want the best impact performers. You still have to be great investors, by the way, of course, but I want the best impact performers.
What is something that everyone in the impact investing business believes to be true that you think is completely wrong?
I guess maybe that the idea that this isn't even a market. Often we talk about impact investing like it's a monolith. I think when I originally came into it, I sort of expected it to be, but in reality, it's not so much. It's a series of different communities and styles and approaches that are all sitting next to one another underneath a very loose and big tent. The value of that big tent has been great in driving progress forward, but really then we could have a very different conversation. Today's been fun because we've covered so many different angles of it, but we can really have a global growth conversation that is very different than an emerging markets venture conversation, that is different from a philanthropically motivated kind of impact first strategy conversation. And all of those are loosely bound together at this point by that label of impact investing. But each of them is its own kind of critical universe unto itself. That is really where you start to get much more into the nuance and complexity of doing this deployment work well.
Is your answer that most people think impact investing is a thing, and actually it's many things in a big tent?
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's, we were asking before about, folks who maybe push back or would challenge this idea of, is this part of my responsibility? Is this part of my opportunity? Is the whole thing is not for anyone, but is there part of it that is relevant for you, your investment strategy, your time horizons, your responsibility? Almost certainly, yes. And so that maybe is one of the opportunities and challenges, is identifying which pieces are most relevant for whom as we look forward to the next chapters of this emerging marketplace.
And now you got all the ESG people rushing the door in the tent.
The risk is, it gets diluted down to be kind of the next ESG, gets politicized and leaves us wondering, how did we get here? The future chapters are not yet written, but are also not certain. The absence of the right leaders and right institutions holding us all accountable for, at the end of the day, that performance piece, right? Like, is the impact performance there? Yes or no?
What's the most counterintuitive piece of advice that you give to clients who want to maximize their social impact?
One of the things we covered before that I would amplify is get really good at saying no. The moments where I've had more heated exchanges with clients is just around that natural tendency of any good professional investor to want to maintain as large of a TAM as possible. And the idea of impact investing is not to limit your TAM, but to just be much clearer about what you're trying to accomplish within it. And that means saying no. And often the most helpful part of the process is, we do this with, we do real names out of people's portfolios, things that they thought might have been good for impact or they had looked at, but they weren't sure of. And we just kind of run them through a little boot camp on it and say, which of these would you say yes to? Why? Which would you say no? And then we bring the data behind it saying that might not be what you thought. And it's a really interesting kind of calibration process for any team and organization to get onto the same page about how you say yes or no to those things. But it's critical to have the no's. If it's a bunch of yeses, it means you're not trying hard enough, but it has to have a few of those no's, and not just obvious no's like coal-fired power plants or things that are obviously bad for the world, but things that are right on the edge. Why? Why do we not like that? Why is that not good enough? What does the data tell us? So it's kind of that building a muscle, not by saying yes, but by learning how to say no.
Would that be your same answer if you're talking to a commercial investor or a philanthropist or a social entrepreneur? Is that just kind of main overarching principle?
I think it is overarching, but what you have to say no to might change a bit, right? So you might, as we see this for folks who come from a more philanthropic orientation, might get really excited about the impact side of the equation, but not fully proof out the business model scalability or the economics of the GP. The last piece of that's a big one, where making sure that any individual GP actually has the right fee structure and scale, particularly in these more focused topic areas. It's really hard to run a GP on $50 to $100 million worth of committed capital, unless you've already got personal cash in the bank to pay yourself while you're waiting for capital to deploy. It's hard. So there's things like that where you say, oh, and by the way, and you're doing proprietary sourcing in really hard to reach places. You probably can't even cover that on a 2% management fee, right? Are you actually building this the right way to scale and realize results? So different hard questions, different reasons to say no, depending on where you're looking, not from a place of skepticism, but more from a place of clarity of, do you know what you like about this thing in order to get to yes?
Michael, I've got a few short answer rapid fire questions I want to ask you before we wrap up our talk today. Just give me the first thing that comes to your mind. And if nothing comes to your mind, feel free to take a pass. That's okay too. If you had to name the single most important challenge in the impact investing space at this point in time, what would that be?
Clear and useful reporting.
What do you know now about impact investing that you wish you knew when you helped build the IMM model?
How much of this is about the decision-making and organizational change of both allocators and asset managers?
You don't have to name names, but describe a project you worked on that ticked all of your impact boxes, just didn't work out, and what was the lesson learned from that experience?
There's one that came to mind, which was a great multiple months of work and a kind of fun product concept that then just became a complete failure to launch for lack of senior firm leadership. It was a great team that was doing the work, but it just didn't have that executive sponsorship and follow through to get all the way through to the top ranks of the organization and get high enough on the fundraising calendar to actually achieve success. Good reminder of how much of this is still an act of leadership and how being clear about who is really backing this and why still matters in the context of these products.
In hindsight, would that have been avoidable? I mean, the lesson learned is that you got to have the right executive sponsorship.
Just like if you're launching any new product or vertical within an established business. Some are going to succeed, some are going to fail to get that escape velocity. And being really clear on why it is that the most senior leadership of that organization is or is not backing that, not just relying on the market or kind of good wishes for it to drive forward, but being really clear and hard-nosed about it from the beginning to say, is there the necessary leadership and sponsorship in place for this thing? Or is this going to fall into the organizational graveyard alongside other initiatives?
Now, the converse of that, can you describe a project that you were skeptical of at the time, or maybe this turned out to be one you said, nah, I don't think that's for us. And in the end, it ultimately exceeded your expectations, or you wish you hadn't passed on it. And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
There's one that came to mind that was a relatively sort of short sprint with a small team. I honestly didn't think that much of it at the time. And I was for more of a mid-sized manager, just to say, well, okay, is this going to matter? Is this going to make a difference? And they ended up having one of the fastest final closes, I think a 3-year period of any products in the market, and then got their second fund out just a couple of years later at about 3 times the scale. And it again, was a place where what I didn't fully appreciate was how much the DNA of the organization was oriented towards this work, and actually was not a resistance or sort of a pushing against, but was almost an enablement of the whole team to say, okay, great, you can do this now. This is part of your mandate. Here's a whole new set of opportunities that you probably were already excited about. Go and chase those as hard and as fast as you can. It was almost an enabler of lighting a fire beneath a team that fundamentally always wanted to do this kind of work.
If someone wants to get into the impact investment space, or perhaps the impact advisory or measurement space, similar to what you're doing, where would you advise them to cut their teeth and to start?
There was a piece that some of the folks at Harvard that researched this actually just looked at this question a couple of weeks ago. And more than anything else, the most common pattern is, it's zebras, not unicorns. So folks in this world tend to have a diversity of different backgrounds and experiences, whether that's some consulting work, some investing experience, some social impact work somewhere along the way. If you follow the sort of full biographies and trajectories, most folks have touched numerous different pieces of the puzzle. And so figuring out what the version of those sort of zebra stripes are for any individual is a pretty customized kind of conversation. What the data says is there's not a path, right? There's not a single way in. It's not like getting into private equity out of banking where there's a well-worn path and you kind of know where the door is and when to knock on it. Careers in this space are still much more made rather than found. And the space is still small enough that there regrettably are not so many opportunities that there's kind of boundless set of chances for it. So that's the reality, is that figuring out like what your specific pattern is and how it matches is really usually the most effective way. The other more pragmatic version for someone who's much earlier on is deciding if you actually want to be an investor or not, and learning how to be an investor, because investing is hard and investing for impact is even harder. So if you haven't learned how to be an investor, it's kind of hard to cut your teeth learning how to just be an impact investor. And obviously there's lots of places in the world where one can learn to become an excellent investor from an earlier career perspective.
Was this study backward looking or forward looking?
I think it was backward looking. I think it was looking at folks who are in seat now at some of the leading named impact firms around the world.
Which would argue, how could it come out any different than the conclusion? This is relatively young as a thing with a name.
But it's also just not at that scale and stage where it has like the institutional sort of summer class pipeline for interns coming out of their first MBA year, and just that kind of dynamics that we see in obviously other elements of finance and professional services, where it's a much cleaner pipe than we would see in this market.
I ask everyone that question, and I get a lot of answers, of course, but I'd have to say probably most are along the line of unprofitable investing is not sustainable. It still has to be financially a good idea. Many people say get a firm foundation if you can in Goldman Sachs or in one of these banks, going through something regimented to really understand how the financial markets work and how analysis is done, because bad investments are bad investments, whether they got an impact or sustainable spin on it. I guess that's probably not what a lot of people want to hear, but I can kind of see that.
The question behind the question, though, is do you actually want to be the investment decision maker? Is that the role that you are seeking specifically, where you are a portfolio manager, a VP, or a partner directly in the investment team? Again, this is assuming the broader context where most of this is in alternatives. It's all basically venture capital, private equity. And the litmus test is if you wouldn't be happy doing venture capital or private equity, period, you're probably not going to be super happy doing venture capital or private equity for impact. It's still the same job. It's just harder because you have to answer additional questions. So from that perspective, it's perhaps a great opportunity to say, do I actually like doing this? Do I like making decisions about individual investments? Or do I find, value in different roles related to the broader ecosystem? Where do you see yourself fitting, and what capability do you need to have within that team? You're totally right. Somebody's got to be able to tell you, is this a good investment?
Michael, I've really enjoyed this. I want to thank you. We went over a lot here today, but I learned a lot from it. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Scott.
And now tell everyone what's the best way they can find out about all the great work that you guys are doing at Bridgespan, your website, social media, all that good stuff that you guys are on.
You can find us at bridgespan.org or over on LinkedIn. You can get access to all of our content and perspectives.
What's the best way for somebody to reach out to you if they wanted to contact you?
You can catch me on LinkedIn as well. That's the easiest place to find me.
All right. Everybody, go to Bridgespan. That's bridge like the bridge you drive your car across, and span.org. Lots of good information there. So, Michael, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.